everyone, welcome back to Castle Goring, chatting with Lady C. Hello Georgie, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Leo. How are you?
I'm very great, thank you, as always.
Good.
Yes. So should we go with the first question?
Absolutely, let's go with the first question.
So the first question is, Lady C, would you get rid of your dog if he didn't like your boyfriend, as Meghan Markle get rid of her dog?
Well, I have to say that is a brilliant question.
Yeah.
I was confronted with the exact situation where a very, very nice man who was great husband material, of whom my father would have approved wholeheartedly, didn't like dogs. And at the time I had two, Tum Tum and Popsy Miranda. And when he thought that the relationship had reached a stage of sufficient seriousness that he could make his move, he tried to get me to get rid of my dogs.
Oh.
And I said to him, I thought it was very well put as well, no, my dear, a man who asks a woman to get rid of her dogs and she gets rid of them is begging for trouble. Because, and I did not realize at the time that I was saying this, that in fact one of the classical symptoms of sociopathy is people who get rid of their pets when they are no longer convenient. So, because the pet has never really been anything more than an accessory to the person. So they have no loyalty. But so I said to him, if I get rid of Tum Tum and Popsy Miranda for you, I said, surely that's giving you the message that I am disloyal, that I have no sincerity, that I have no staying power, that I will do exactly what suits the person whom I'm trying to impress, etc., etc., etc. And I read him a whole long spiel as to why I thought it was a terrible thing to do. And at the end of it, I said, now, not being mean, but I think we can wrap it up in a two-letter word that begins with N and ends in O.
So it's no.
So not only have I been in that situation, but having been in it, I absolutely refuse to play ball. And I also pointed out to him, I said, a man who asks a woman to do something like that, to give up things she loves and things that are dependent on her for their whole well-being, I said, I really don't think that's something you should be asking anybody. And I really do think it's
I think the noise will be on the...
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Oh, and we have Mickey snoring throughout it all. Mickey's so secure that she knows that her Mottie would never give her up. Not for any man, woman, or child, or anything. Not any amount of anything. No money, no nothing. Mickey's too precious. And so... Oh,
when you grab the Mickey.
Oh, thank you very much, Leo. Thank you.
Wait.
So very kind. Thank you. So, okay, so that's correct.
Fine.
That
Yes.
good.
Yes.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you so
Need to
much.
be bling bling side.
Well, absolument. We need to be bling bling.
As well, you wrote a book about your dog.
Well, no. I ghosted a book that Tum Tum wrote. It's called With Love from Pet Heaven by Tum Tum the Springer Spaniel. It actually is for sale still. It's a wonderful, wonderful, I channeled it. It was so marvelous writing that book because Tum Tum, the concept was that Tum Tum has died and she's gone to pet heaven, and she is reminiscing about life in pet heaven, and she's also reminiscing about her life on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And I channeled Tum Tum. I mean, she was the most wonderful dog. She was so intelligent and she used to converse. We used to have conversations because Tum Tum was my first child. So I spoilt her rotten. And she used to, she went everywhere with me. Then Popsy Miranda came along after 21 months. And she had Popsy Miranda and some other dogs. And I kept Popsy Miranda. And we were a real trio until the boys were born. And oh, heaven, heaven. So I wrote this book. I suppose, so I channeled this book. I ghosted it. And it's because, you know, Tum Tum was amazing. She actually foiled an abduction. Because when Dima, have I not said this before?
Yes, you told me this story.
But have I told you?
No, on the camera, no.
Oh. Tum Tum was an amazing dog because on 2 separate occasions she foiled really serious crimes. The first one was when she was at Battersea Park with Pops and Miranda, Joyce, the children's nanny, and the boys in the play area at Battersea Park. All the nannies knew each other and they'd get together every day and they'd natter, chatter, and the children more or less took care of themselves, it emerges. And I received a phone call from the police at Battersea Park telling me I had to come to the park immediately because somebody had tried to abduct Dima, a paedophile. And Tum Tum foiled it because while all of the nannies were busy chatting and didn't notice this man who it turned out had been hanging around for a few weeks. And so they all got used to him being there. And this would have been in 1996 or 97. So people weren't quite as au fait with things as they now are. And they just thought, oh, well, this is an old man just hanging around, or middle-aged man. I think he was in his 50s, they thought. And he went in because it's fenced in, got Dima out and was walking off with Dima. And Tum Tum ran after him and grabbed him by the heels, by his ankle, and bit into him. And he hollered. And that's when they realised that, but for Tum Tum, he could have taken away Dima, and Joyce and the rest of the other nannies would still have been oblivious. So there was that. And then Tum Tum and Pops Miranda stood out on the stoop of the house at Bourne Street, and somebody had got in because the nanny had not locked the door properly. She was supposed to double lock it and she hadn't double locked it, and if you didn't lock it carefully, that's why I insisted it always be double locked. That, you know, somebody could get in. And sure enough, she hadn't locked it properly, and somebody got in. And Tum Tum and Pops Miranda stayed on that stoop and barked and barked. Well, Pops Miranda didn't bark, but she stayed with Tum Tum. And Susan Grindling, who was our neighbour at number 44 Bourne Street, who knew Tum Tum and Pops Miranda, and we sort of looked out for each other because she was a great, great person. She was a wonderful lady. And Susan thought something's wrong, went, and she saw somebody at the house and she confronted him and he fled. But had it not been for Tum Tum barking, Susan would not have known. And the nanny was in the house with the children, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd allowed or let in somebody inadvertently. So Tum Tum was, and there's a funny story of Tum Tum and the Queen.
Oh, yes, I know.
Which is in the book. Queen used to come and visit quite regularly at Lochmo House where I lived. And she used to visit Mrs. Osborne King, who was one of her ladies in waiting, who lived upstairs. So my flat was on the ground floor. There were 3 flats on the ground floor, and mine was a central flat, literally beside the lift. So at the time, I was writing down in private, so I looked like the back of the bus because I was writing pretty much around the clock. And there were inner doors and outer doors at Lochmo House because it was a block of flats. And I had a habit of opening up my door, and the dogs there were 2 sets of doors. The outer doors that opened up onto the courtyard, which had a central roadway, because it was a complex of 4 blocks of flats, the Cundy Street flats. And then there were inner doors that were swing doors. And I would open up my door and Tum Tum and Pops and Miranda would bolt and grind to a halt at the inner doors and wait for me to open them. Well, it so happens that I opened the door and Mr. Osborne King had his bottom holding the right-hand door. The Queen was beyond the left-hand door and Mrs. Osborne King was curtsying to her goodbye. So the outer doors are still shut. Well, the problem with the Cundy Street flats was because we had people like Richard Luce, who was at the time a minister in the government, and we had people like George Younger, Lord Hume of the Hersal, and various junior members of the extended royal family and former ministers of state, ministers of government. So there were all of these government people living there, and the security people would open up the barriers because there was a barrier. So you'd open up the barrier and the car would enter and go left and all the way around and drop off. It was usually Richard Luce's security details that they would screaming at about 50 miles an hour because the first car would have come. Because this thing, remember, in those days also the IRA was a threat. So it wasn't completely out of line what they were doing. And there was intense security surrounding ministers of government and ministers of state. So what would happen is that the front security car would come, they'd open up the barriers because it had a gate that was a barrier. It would swing open automatically. The car would tear in. Behind it would be the minister's car, and then behind that would be a backup security car. And on several occasions, they'd practically run over people's dogs. And I, a few weeks before this, had gone up to them and I had said to them, you have got to stop tearing in here and thinking that this is a race course because people have their dogs. And if you continue doing this, one of these days, you're going to kill one of the dogs. And I can tell you something, if you kill mine, you are going to be a corpse as well. So the Queen, of course, knows nothing of this. And I have to tell you, it was interesting because the Queen used to come with her driver and her private detective, no big palaver. Well, the Queen, of course, doesn't realise the danger to the dogs, but and how would she? She didn't live there, and she jumps when she sees Tum Tum and Pops and Miranda shoot out of my flat into the central hall, and Mrs. Osborne King is curtsying to her. She decides she's going to be helpful, and she jumps and opens up the outer doors, little realizing that she has now put the dogs' lives in danger. Because I used to make sure that the barrier was down before opening up the doors, just in case, because the dogs would go shooting out. And if one of the security cars was going at 40 and 50 miles an hour, it would run over the dog. And she opens the door to be helpful. I screamed. And she immediately, she is so quick, I cannot tell you, on the uptake. She immediately realized what she'd done. But it was too late. She'd done it. So I fled with no thought to knocking her over. She was well out of the way, I've got to tell you. She's very clued up. She's not stupid, the Queen. And I fled out, screaming for Popsy, Miranda and Tum Tum. When I realized that they were perfectly okay, that everything was going to be fine, I then dropped a curtsy and apologized. And she said, "Oh, it's perfectly okay," or words to that effect. She understood, she said. She got it in one, but she really did. And I realized, once I screamed, you could see in the split second that it all happened that she clocked what was going on. But it was too late. So anyway, I did my curtsy afterwards. And then Mrs. Osborne King's daughter, Mim, was a great friend of mine. So of course the story came back via them as well as to what the Queen thought of my shriek and then my curtsy. But the curtsy was okay, but it was a shriek. I have to tell you, I didn't give a thought to the fact that it was the Queen. All I thought was, my God. But so that was Tum Tum and Popsy.
Great. So we go to another question, which will be linked to another Queen. As we stay to this topic. So the question is, do you think that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, as a young debutante, initially had her sights set on Edward, the Duke of Windsor? He appears to have rejected her advances, as did James Stuart.
Yes.
Is it possible that she became bitter against the two women that captured the hearts of these men, especially Wallis Simpson? Bertie did not appear to be her great love, but a means of social climbing. Best wishes from the Isle of Skye, Scottish Highlands.
Well, I wrote a biography of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, called The Untold Life of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother.
Yeah.
And that question is touched upon quite heavily in my book, because the Duke of Windsor, who was known within the family as David, his regnant name was Edward, but he was known within the family as David. He maintained always that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had set her cap for him, that he had no interest whatsoever in her, which he wouldn't have. He liked very modern, svelte, chic, snappy women, and she was not svelte, she was not chic, and she was not snappy except intellectually. She was very bright, but she wasn't sort of, like Thelma Furness or Wallis Simpson, who were very sort of thin and chic and modern. He liked modern women. And this is by his own account, by the way. This is not me interpreting what I've read. This is what I was told by people who knew him well, and this is in letters, private letters, that he definitely rejected her advances, and she was quite sweet on him, and she made it very apparent that she was sweet on him. She had been at the time crazy about Jamie Stewart, who was, he subsequently became Viscount Stewart of Findhorn, and ironically enough, his son married the sister of a chum of mine. It just shows you the wheels within wheels. She was in love with him, but she wanted to marry she wanted to marry David, who was then the Prince of Wales, because she was very ambitious. By this time, Queen Mary, she was aware that Bertie was obsessively in love with Elizabeth, and that he had proposed twice and been turned down twice. That was okay, but when she realized that Elizabeth had set her cap for David, she took steps through her lady-in-waiting and great friend Mabel, who was Lady Airlie, who was a neighbour of the Boweslands and great friends with the Boweslands, to instruct Mabel to tell everybody in Scotland to stop asking Elizabeth whenever any of her children were present. And Mabel Airlie tipped off Celia Strathmore, who was Elizabeth's mother, that she was being relegated to social Siberia, and there was absolutely no prospect of Queen Mary lifting the injunction, because she was absolutely spitting mad that Elizabeth was playing Peter off against Paul in the hope of, and a very unrealistic hope that was never going to happen in any event. And then Bertie was, you can come up if you want, Mickey, come on. Don't look at me, come on, up. If you want to come up. But you have to make up your mind. Good girl. And that, so she effectively had ordered that Elizabeth Bowesland be put into Coventry. Mm-hmm. At that point, Elizabeth made it known. She was very resourceful. She was very ambitious. There have been a series of ambitious women, starting with Elizabeth Bowesland, who have entered the royal family. Diana was another one, and Meghan Markle is another one. And she got in touch with Bertie, and she revisited the scenario and made it clear that she would entertain his attentions once more. Apropos of all of that, Elizabeth was also in love, as I said earlier, with Jamie Stewart.
Yes.
And Queen Mary, thinking initially that was the problem, organised for him to be given a job in the oil industry in, if I remember correctly, Oklahoma.
Very far.
And he was duly dispatched to America, and of course this would have been in the early 1920s when travel was not what it is nowadays. And he was duly got rid of. But then, of course, when it emerged that he wasn't the only problem, that Elizabeth's ambitions were the problem, that's when Queen Mary moved with Lady Airlie to block Elizabeth altogether. And she then came to her senses and discovered that she was in love with Bertie after all. And she was, and she did create a very happy family life for him. And so we cannot criticize her in terms of the family life that she created for him. But she certainly was very ambitious. So I think that was a very interesting question. And it's all of it, all the detail is in my book, The Untold Life of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Just as how, I mean, this is becoming like an advertisement for books, and it's really not intended to be.
Yes.
But just as how Tum Tum, with Love from Pet Heaven by Tum Tum, the Springer Spaniel, and all of Tum Tum's antics are in that book, which I have to tell you was the only book I've ever written that was an unexpurgated joy.
Yes.
Oh, and because Tum Tum was dead, it was just so wonderful to channel her. Such a joy.
We can jump to the last question for today.
Yes.
If you'd like.
Yes.
One more.
Yes.
Okay. So the question is, Lady C, do you know any of the post-Shah of Iran's family, or princesses, etc.? What happened to them all after 1979 when the Ayatollah took over?
Yes, I've met some of them.
Yes.
Shahbaz Pahlavis, who was the Shah's nephew, is a great friend of great friends of mine. So I have seen him many times over the years at various parties, and he is one of the nicest, most charming, very good looking, too gorgeous looking man, and really just a delight. The Empress Farah, who is his aunt by marriage, I've met once or twice. The last time I saw her was when the King of Sweden's aunt had her 90th birthday party in Stockholm, and I was asked, my son Dima accompanied me, and he actually was seated beside Crown Princess Victoria. And the Empress Farah was there, and her granddaughter, who was stunningly beautiful, was on the children's table, the children being Crown Princess Victoria, and Dima, and all of the young people. And so after dinner, I went up to speak to Dima, and he introduced me to, I don't remember her name, she's a beautiful girl, ravishingly beautiful. And then Empress Farah came up, and so we were having a little chatty. What is really interesting, on a slightly different note, is how customs and habits have changed. I remember in 1968, when both my mother and I used to smoke, we coming out of a store on Fifth Avenue, I think it was Saks, and I lit up a cigarette, and she said, "You're not supposed to smoke on the street." So I said, "I'm dying for a cigarette. I'm going to smoke it. Everybody in New York smokes." She said, "Civilized people don't smoke on streets." I've never forgotten it, because of course she was absolutely right. In 1968, it was the height of poor form to smoke on the street. Fast forward. We are in our car waiting in the queue to be disgorged onto the red carpet, because it was done by precedence. and you have to, it's timed as well. So each car is given its 90 seconds or whatever, and so it's all very carefully programmed, so to speak. And so Deemer and I are in the car, and I cast my eye, and who is standing on the steps of the Grand Hotel smoking a cigarette, which is effectively on the street, but Empress Farah. So I said to Dima, I said, God, I said, if Mummy were alive, she wouldn't believe how the world has changed. There is an empress smoking cigarettes on the street because she smokes like a chimney. Oh, and gorgeous looking woman still.
Yes.
Gorgeous. They're a really good looking family. I think that what happened in Iran was a great tragedy. The Shah was, for all his failings, infinitely preferable to the Ayatollahs. I remember in 1978 on my way into Royal Ascot, the Crown Prince of Persia was the Queen's guest of honour. And as we were walking in to the royal enclosure, there were people with placards, out with the shit of Persia. And, he had become a great hate figure because he was standing in the way of human rights in Iran. As it turns out, he wasn't standing in the way of human rights in Iran. He was the protector of such human rights as existed. And his savak, which was extremely cruel, was nothing compared with what has gone since. So to talk about swapping a black dog for a monkey, as the Jamaicans would say, I don't think there's very much prospect of a restoration of the monarchy in Iran. And I think it's a tragedy that they ever got rid of the monarchy, because they were a secular state with far more human rights than they had ever had before, and far more human rights than they have had since. And just very tragic, the whole thing. But it is said General Hauser, who was in charge of the American army in Iran, he said very proudly, "We threw the Shah out like a dead mouse," because the Shah in 1973 had dared to create within the OPEC bloc to raise the oil prices. And this really was the revenge of the West, because the Shah was eager to have too much money for his people. And that's why the English and the Americans, because the English connived with getting rid of the Shah. Ayatollah Khomeini was in exile in Paris, and he was given unprecedented access via the BBC to broadcast all of the poison to bring down the Shah. I'm sure, had the English and the Americans realized what they were doing, they might have hesitated to do it. But they did not realize, and I'm sorry, ignorance is not an excuse when you're speaking about the fate of nations and the fate of tens and maybe even hundreds of millions of people. Ignorance is inexcusable, and their conduct was inexcusable. And I am not saying that the Shah did not have issues with human rights violations. But as it turns out, he was fighting the Muslim fundamentalists, and therefore, maybe he knew rather better than they did. And I'm not excusing human rights violations, but I would sooner live in a country that is relatively free and where people can come and go as they please. And if you are intent on bringing down the government, you are scooped up and have your human rights violated. It's not good, but I think it's infinitely preferable to women being thrown in prison because they have dared to show their face. And it's all a matter of what's proportionate. And that's just my take on it. And I do know that every secular person in Iran would agree with me. And many people who are forced to agree with the present regime basically sympathize with what I'm saying. People look back on the days of the Shah as if it was nirvana.
Yes, true. Well, thank you very much again today, sharing all this experience with us. I hope they will continue writing the questions for us, and we will speak with you very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.